Episode 434 of the FDH Lounge is brought to you by Sportsology, delivering unconventional columns and webcasts about sports, TV, music, movies, and more. Follow them on the web at sportsology.info.
The FDH Lounge. You'll want to schedule your life around it.
A long time ago, on a gloomy, wet Cleveland spring night, two men stand alone amidst the late-night drizzle. Their voices echo across the vacant station parking lot as they debate the merits of the great American radio show that have been missing for far too long. On that night, an idea was born. That idea became the FDH Lounge. Welcome to the FDH Lounge.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to FDH Lounge mini-episode number 434. This is FDH Managing Partner Rick Morris. We've got with us here today a tremendous panel discussion. We are going to be taking a look back at the 2014 NHL season, first with the Stanley Cup playoffs that just wrapped up and whatever lessons we can draw from the playoffs, the Stanley Cup final, the season as a whole. We're going to be talking about that. We had a great panel going into the Stanley Cup final with good friend Russ Cohen of Sportsology and also with Keith Korneluk of Sticktap TV. Keith is with us today, as well as good friend Steve Kallas, who we've had on the show to talk any number of subjects. FDH Lounge Dignitary Steve Kallas. You can hear him, of course, on thestn.net with his regular show on there Monday through Friday, noon Eastern time, as well as appearances that he makes from time to time on WFAN in New York and, of course, SNY and a number of other great outlets out there. So it's great to have them both on the program. First, we'll welcome back to the show one of our favorite guests that we've had from time to time to talk hockey, Keith Korneluk. Keith, welcome back to the FDH Lounge, sir. Always good to have you in talking hockey.
Hey, Rick. Hey, nice to talk to you again. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. Looking forward to breaking down the series with you and the season as a whole. Also, good friend, FDH Lounge Dignitary Steve Kallas. Steve, welcome back to the show, my man. Good to be talking hockey with you.
Good to be talking with you and Keith.
Again, I think this is going to be a tremendous discussion as we take a look back. And, of course, each of you guys based in the media markets of the respective Stanley Cup finalists, of course, Steve being out there for the New York Rangers and following them probably most closely as well. So a tremendous thing to be able to break down these two teams. The outcome of the series, not a surprise to any of the three of us, nor to Russ Cohen, who I think very reluctantly picked against his New York Rangers in this series. You kind of had to go that way if you were just looking at pure logic. I'll start with you, Keith, in terms of this being the one series where L.A. really didn't have to go to the mat, didn't get stretched to 7 games. They did get stretched to overtime in a couple of the games, so they showed a lot of their kind of famed resiliency that they have put on display in 2014 within the context of a 5-game series. Did it play out more or less like you expected in terms of, again, on paper, the Rangers not as tough a team to get past as Chicago, Anaheim, even San Jose, but they were pretty much, for a 5-game series, it did seem like it was pretty competitive.
I thought so, too. And, I mean, certainly with the overtime, it could have gone either way, quite a few times. I was surprised that it didn't go the distance, or at least until 6. I mean, that's certainly the LA Kings' resiliency, but I thought that there was going to be more from the Rangers. I thought, I thought Lundqvist was brilliant in the one game that they did win, but just wasn't enough. I mean, looking at the Kings, I really thought that for us, the toughest series was the Chicago Blackhawks, and once we got to the Rangers, I thought it would be difficult. And not that it wasn't, but I think it was definitely, I was surprised that they got by them in 5.
I was a little bit as well. I picked it to go 6 going into it. And, again, it had not been easy for the Kings any step of the way in the previous series that they had gone through. And, again, in the context of this specific series, I think you could say not exactly an easy one, albeit for 5 games. Steve, your thoughts on this? I know that you were breaking this down from the New York area and observing it up close as well. Your thoughts on how this played out? A little bit of a moment in the sun for Henrik Lundqvist as far as finally making it to the Cup final and giving a pretty good showing of himself under the circumstances. But it comes away looking like, again, just another team that it depended a lot on the King and maybe not a whole lot else from some of the other key players.
Well, it was clear that the difference, and I wrote this before the finals, the difference between, and people in New York I don't think understood this, people understood that Jonathan Quick was a Stanley Cup winning goaltender and that Henrik Lundqvist wasn't, but I don't think people in New York realized that not only was Quick a Stanley Cup winning goaltender, but he won the Conn Smythe Trophy as the MVP of the playoffs. To me, that even takes his experience up a notch. So while I think it was one of the closest, if not the closest, 5-game series, I can go way back to the late 60s when Glenn Hall, when they expanded from 6 teams to 12 teams, and Glenn Hall played for the St. Louis Blues, and they were swept in the finals by the Canadiens, and every game was 1 goal, and they actually gave Glenn Hall the Conn Smythe Trophy for MVP of the entire playoffs. I won't say that was the same thing here, because I thought Lundqvist played really well, but I don't think he, as Keith kind of alluded to, he wasn't the king. If anything, Jonathan Quick outplayed Lundqvist, even though, of course, the Kings incredibly outshot the Rangers in a number of these games. So I thought it was a very, very close series. And I have to say, when you go on the road and take 2-goal leads against the Kings, and I understand the Kings were great at coming back in games and coming back in series, but when you go on the road and lose 3 overtime games in the other guy's building, I don't view that to be a lopsided series. When it was 3-0 in New York, people were saying, and people were coming out of the woodwork after the fact, now everybody agrees the Kings are a better team, they're bigger, they're stronger. I thought they actually had an edge, much as I love Lundqvist, I thought they had an edge in Quick and goal because of his experience in the Stanley Cup.
Well, I got a follow-up question, and I'll start with you, Steve, since you're the one who raised it. This is something we talked about on our Stanley Cup final preview as far as coming into the series. There really hasn't been anybody who's grabbed a hold of the torch from the generation of Hasek and Brodeur and Waugh, those guys. I mean, probably the closest we've seen over the last decade would be Lundqvist. You've got, in the last couple of years, Lundqvist. You've got Tuukka Rask, who has yet to win a Stanley Cup. And now Jonathan Quick, who, again, a lot of people aren't going to put on their level in terms of statistics, but he now has 2 cups. He's had pretty good statistics a couple of those years, and a Western Conference final the year in between the 2 cup runs. So in terms of legacy, I think people still look at Lundqvist as the preeminent goaltender in the NHL right now. But did what we saw in that series, even with Quick having obviously a lot more help defensively and otherwise, does that narrow the gap or maybe tip it a little bit in Quick's direction?
Well, I'm a New York guy, and I love Lundqvist, but I would have to give the advantage to Quick. At the end of the day, you're not going to total up Stanley Cups, but I do think it's important, and I'll say it again, he won the Conn Smythe Trophy the first time the Kings won the Cup, and he was excellent in this series and these playoffs. I thought he could have gotten the Conn Smythe Trophy this time around, but I think the key statistic and the thing that puts him ahead of Lundqvist, even though obviously offensively the Rangers are just, I mean, Brad Richards, who they just bought out, he's gone. Richards and Nash, I mean, they literally could not score. It was amazing. But I think the most amazing stat in the whole series, and maybe Keith can comment on this, is the fact that not only did Jonathan Quick not give up a goal in overtime, obviously the Kings won all 3 of those games in overtime, but he also never gave up a goal in the third period of any game. And to me, I didn't really have time to go back and look at all prior Stanley Cups, but I'd be hard-pressed to think that there's a goalie in the history of the Stanley Cup who didn't give up a goal to the opposition in the third period and in 3 overtime games in the Stanley Cup final. And I understand that the Rangers were offensively challenged, but I think that's a stunning statistic. And again, if you asked me today, and I love Lundqvist, I would give the edge to Jonathan Quick.
That is remarkable. Yeah, Keith, let me get your thoughts on that. And as far as the 2 Stanley Cups, I realize that only goes so far. And again, Chris Osgood, I was a big backer of his, defended him against a lot of my fellow Red Wing fans back in the day. But again, 2 Stanley Cups for him. Nobody's even looking to put him in the Hall of Fame, much less talk about goaltender of a generation. Now, again, there are the names we talked about before that Osgood was butting up against. But for Quick getting the second one, and particularly with the dearth that we've seen over the last decade, we talked about it a little bit coming into the Stanley Cup final, guys like Mika Kiprusoff that really didn't sustain it, Cam Ward, et cetera. For Quick in this generation to have the 2 Stanley Cups, to have the kind of final that Steve was discussing there in terms of not surrendering the goals in the third period or, of course, in overtime, what does this do, bumping his legacy ahead of where it was coming into the final?
Well, I think the astounding thing is that Quick played most of the playoffs with a broken wrist. I mean, he just underwent surgery. He's going to be out 10 to 12 weeks. That happened against the Ducks. So that was pretty impressive. And I certainly think you can, I think Steve makes a good point. I mean, in 2012, the Kings won the Cup because of Jonathan Quick. I mean, without Jonathan Quick, they wouldn't have even come close because he was playing so out of his mind. Now, you look at this year, and his performance kind of dropped. His stats weren't as good as they had been in the past. You can maybe blame the injury on that. And I think it's credit to Daryl Sutter's system, and the defense really takes a lot off of him. But at the end of the day, he can still make the great saves, and when it counts, in overtime, he's able to make that happen. I'd put Quick and Lundqvist kind of up there, top 1-2 goalies in the league. I mean, I think you're going to need a few more years to really tell who is the guy of this era. That really comes out on top. I think that's hard to say. And, trophy, I mean, Lundqvist has a Vezina, Quick doesn't quite yet. And, I think it's kind of a work in progress. We got to see what happens, But at the end of the day, I mean, you got to be a solid goaltender, to win in the National Hockey League. But you also have to have a good team in front of you that's willing to, pick up the loose pucks and things like that. So, you have to look at who's in front of you as well.
Absolutely. When you're talking about one guy having a Conn Smythe and one guy having a Vezina, I guess that's the thing that kind of separates when we were talking about the previous generation. Those guys had hardware all over the place. These guys obviously still a work in progress, albeit Lundqvist probably has less time left in his prime due to age than does Jonathan Quick. But in terms of the landscape of the league right now, Keith, just what it took to get into the Stanley Cup final this year, it came down to the battle that we were expecting all year long. It may not have looked like it was going to go that way for a while in the playoffs when the Kings were down 3-0 to San Jose and really battling to get past Anaheim. But Los Angeles and Chicago, clearly the best rivalry in the league right now. 4 of the last 5 Stanley Cups between them. And the team that has the other one in that mix, the Boston Bruins, also having made it to the Stanley Cup final and lost another year. So between those 3 teams, the ones that have dominated the decade that we are now halfway through, as hard as that might be to believe, but we are at that point. In terms of L.A. and Chicago and how they shape up, and it's such a fine line between them. There were a lot of people like myself that picked Chicago to get past L.A. In the Western Conference Final just because of the way it went last year. Some of the games in the regular season looked like L.A. was going to maybe have a problem matching up with some of the specifics there. They did it. They got through. Not to be somebody that is going for Chicago over L.A. all the time because, again, as a Red Wing fan, it calls me to do that. But going into next year, if it is really a razor's edge between the 2 teams, do you kind of give the edge to Chicago because, like Los Angeles this year, the hungrier team, the one coming off of the bitter loss, it now goes to Chicago, who's got all summer to think about what happened to them?
I think it all depends on what moves Chicago makes in the offseason. We know where the Kings are. They re-signed Matt Green. They re-signed Marian Gaborik today. It's a 7-year deal. So they're pretty much set. We might need another defenseman. As far as Chicago goes, they need a second-line center. I mean, it starts with your goaltending and defense, and then it's how deep you are down the middle. They don't quite have that. I know Ryan Kessler, the rumor is out there that the only teams he'll accept a trade to is Anaheim and Chicago. But you get a guy like Kessler on, Chicago's second line, and you're looking at a gigantic upgrade for the Blackhawks. So I still think they'll be neck and neck. Ever since I moved to Los Angeles and became, a Kings fan, I always hated playing the Blackhawks because you kind of expect to lose. So I'm a little jaded. I still think Chicago might have an edge over the Kings, but all going to depend on what Chicago does in the offseason.
Absolutely, and the front office has done a tremendous job over the last couple of years of upgrading, filling holes, and as you pointed out, they need a little bit more offensive depth there to be sure. Obviously, they're very top-heavy and very, very skilled on the first line and able to do a lot of damage there. Steve, thoughts in the Eastern Conference as far as, again, the Rangers having made it to the quote-unquote Final Four 2 of the last 3 years, but notwithstanding that, and notwithstanding being the defending Eastern Conference champions, in the minds of most people, I would guess, including myself, Boston's still the favorite because, again, a Stanley Cup and a Stanley Cup finalist berth the last couple of years. Thoughts on the landscape of the Eastern Conference, how it shakes out, and what the Rangers might have to do or anybody else to get past Boston?
Well, I'll tell you, as I'm sure both of you guys know, the Rangers had an incredibly emotional run to the finals. They were literally down 3-1 to the Penguins, had played as bad a game as you could play in Game 4 against the Penguins. And you know, this was a topic of conversation throughout New York. How did they turn it around? How could the Rangers possibly do it? But, you know, Dominic Moore had come back after sitting out for a year, and the Rangers were really, you know, to me, they were kind of really, frankly, in a hole. But they were able to overcome, you know, family deaths, you know, all about the stuff that happened up in Montreal as well, and Pittsburgh. So they were able to overcome a lot of things in not your normal, for lack of a better word, you know, in not your normal way in terms of grinding it out in the playoffs. But, you know, the Rangers have to give a lot of credit. Martin St. Louis' mom died after Game 4. It was very weird, strange timing. They were able to rally. The funeral was up in Montreal when they were started to play the Canadiens. It really was an emotional, different kind of high that brought the team together. And I'm certainly not going to sit here and say I expect the Rangers to get back. I think this is Lundqvist's best chance to get a cup, because the Rangers were also fortunate that the Canadiens beat the Bruins, because very few people in New York thought that the Rangers could beat the Bruins. If you go back to last year, I remember writing an article, what do you do when your goalie stands on his head and you still lose? Because Lundqvist played great against the Bruins last year, and the Rangers lost in 5 games. So I think it's going to shape out for the Bruins and the Penguins again to be the favorites. Would the Rangers have beaten the Penguins if not for a, frankly, strange emotional lift from the fact that Martin St. Louis' mom passed away just after Game 4? I mean, it was really bizarre. But to their credit, they rode that emotion all the way to the Cup Finals, and frankly did run into a bigger and stronger team.
They did harness it, and again, getting a lot of great effort and inspirational and emotional play down the stretch from Martin St. Louis, who I had pointed out in our series preview. If you just looked at it start to finish last decade, really was as great offensively as any forward that you could name in the league. The guys who came in halfway through tend to overshadow him: Crosby, Ovechkin, Malkin, etc. But start to finish, nobody was probably better than St. Louis, and it'll be interesting to see what he's got left for them next year. As far as this past season and our first season under the new format of the playoffs, I'd like to get some thoughts from you guys on this. The league thought that this was going to do a lot to beef up rivalries, geographic ones, traditional ones, and it seems to have done just that. Keith, thoughts on this? Under this format, it's hard to imagine, for example, that Los Angeles and Chicago would meet up before the conference finals. It is now possible because you could get 3 teams coming from one division, 5 from another, and if one of them was a quote-unquote wild card that slid into the other division, you could have that, but it seems unlikely at this point, even though Los Angeles didn't have an overwhelming regular season record. It still seems likely that these 2 teams for the foreseeable future will be towards the top of their divisions and avoiding that. So you have that eliminated as a possibility for the most part. I think that you'd have them meeting early on. And you're going to have things where, again, L.A. is going to have to get past Anaheim and vice versa, scenarios like that in order to make the conference finals. It seems from my vantage point to have worked the way that the league wanted it to. What did you think of it this year?
I think at the beginning of the playoffs, I had to look it up and remember how this whole playoff format worked, because it was a little confusing for me. But I liked that it created a lot of rivalries, and it certainly looked like it worked out this year. You know, you saw some good stuff in the East and the West. You know, when the top California teams face each other, it creates some drama for those that are interested in California hockey. So I really enjoyed it, and if it continues to play out this way, I think it's going to be really interesting, and you're going to start getting some classic rivalries like you're used to in the past. So I'm a fan.
Yeah, I was as well. I thought that it shook out well. It was part of the league's move back to 4 divisions this past year, the first time that they've done that in the age of 30 teams in the NHL. Steve, your thoughts on it? The Eastern Conference, again, for everybody like myself that was expecting this kind of boring run through the playoffs, Pittsburgh and Boston again, just like Chicago and L.A. ended up doing in the West. They both end up getting upended in the second round. It seems like the format probably played to the benefit of the Rangers because they didn't have to go through Boston. I don't know under the old system if they might have drawn them or not. Instead, you end up getting the Rangers and Montreal in the Eastern Conference Final, an original six rivalry, one that can get very heated, as we saw there. So it seemed like in the East it did what it was supposed to do in terms of generating excitement and getting some rivalries fired up again. What were your thoughts on the first year of the new playoff system?
Yeah, I kind of like the new playoff system. I would suggest something even more radical that will never happen, and I would specifically analogize it to the NBA as well. When you have conferences that are viewed to be much better, and I agree that the West is better to much better than the East in hockey, and as we all would agree, I assume the West is much better than the East in basketball as well. I thought they should consider taking the 4 wild card teams after they've picked the 12, which would be the 3 top teams in each division. I think maybe they should throw all the rest of the teams into one group, a wild card group, and then just maybe take the top 4 teams from that wild card group, which in basketball you'd have many better teams in the West for sure this past year, for example, and in hockey as well, because I do agree in terms of talent and depth, the West was better than the East. Again, I don't think they would ever do that, so I kind of like this the way it worked out this year, and that's not something you usually hear. Normally you'll get a traditionalist like me saying, oh, this is ridiculous, how can they do this? But I think it worked out well, and I think it's kind of fair. But I also think they could even take it a step further. That would never happen, because then you could have more teams from the West make the playoffs than the East. Although I think we all would agree in hockey and definitely in basketball, probably more teams from the West should make the playoffs because they're simply better and deeper in the Western Conference of both of those leagues.
Clearly that is the case. I would agree with that. I think most people would. That is common sense. Quick follow-up question, though. That sounds like the kind of thing that might get the Players Association panties in a wad. No? Seems like you could be setting up for some really interesting travel possibilities here, maybe even West Coast to East Coast in the first round, conceivably.
Yeah, but, they just did it in the finals. Air traffic today isn't what it was 30, 50, 70 years ago. The Rangers and the Kings just did it. If they had to do it again, would that be at a disadvantage? Well, I would just say this about that. If you're one of the teams who are just squeezing into the playoffs with a better record, you have to, at a minimum, be willing to do that. And the team that's the higher seed will have 4 games in their hometown, so it wouldn't be as bad travel-wise. But that's a good point, Rick. But again, I don't think we see in baseball teams, the Yankees in Oakland years ago played on a Wednesday at Yankee Stadium and flew to Oakland and played on a Thursday. And I used to think that was unbelievably ridiculous because they always had a travel day in the playoffs. Now they don't even do that in baseball, and I understand baseball is not hockey, but my point is the travel, and it's hard to travel and play, I get that, but the travel is not nearly as difficult as it once was.
Absolutely, and we have seen on rare occasions in the playoffs the last couple of years some opportunities for back-to-back games, and sometimes I think even when there's travel involved. It doesn't happen very often. It usually happens to accommodate TV, but that does generally happen once in a while, maybe once a season it seems like. I could be off on the average, but that's about what it seems to me. In terms of this summer, in terms of looking ahead to next year, I'd like to get a thought from you guys each on anything interesting and or surprising that you think may happen, whether it's some of the top teams we're talking about here, the Kings, the Rangers, the Blackhawks, the Bruins, etc., or anything else. Anything that you think we should be looking for in this off season to help shape next season. I'll start with you, Keith.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what Pittsburgh does. I mean, I know they just hired their coach. And it'll be interesting to see what kind of stamp Jim Rutherford puts on the team, whether it's through free agency. There was talk that James Neal might be dangled, which would be very interesting. So I'm interested to see what happens there. The Rangers talking to Dan Boyle, I think that's interesting. It'll be interesting to see what Glenn Sader does to, try and get his team over the edge. And I'm very interested to see what the Oilers do this year. They seem to be very motivated to get out of the cellar. I mean, how many times can you draft in the top 5 and still, miss the playoffs? So it's going to be very interesting to see what happens there. And where does Ryan Miller end up? Not a lot of openings here in the Western Conference unless he does a San Jose, and San Jose being another team that it'll be interesting to see what happens to them. So I think there's a lot of teams out there that have some real needs and not a lot in the free agent market. It will be definitely something to watch, what kind of contracts Molson and Vanek get. Given, especially Vanek's performance in the playoffs, I don't think he's going to be commanding $8 million a season, but where does he go? Does he predictably go to the Wild, or is there another team? Does somebody overpay for him? I think it'll be a very interesting free agency to watch, certainly from LA's perspective, locking up Gabbert today. I think it's going to be a boring day if you're a Kings fan, but very interesting to watch how the rest of the league plays out.
Absolutely. And again, fortunately for the Kings, their needs are very few, as they demonstrated in going through a historic postseason. And certainly, again, there are a lot of different things you mentioned there that are really of note. And, whatever happens in Pittsburgh and the way that shakes out, they've had a real run of underachievement the last couple of years, and this could be a real pivot moment for that franchise on whether it ends and whether they pick up again where they left off 2008 and 2009. Steve, thoughts from you on this? Anything interesting, unexpected, surprising, anything at all we should be looking for this summer, do you think?
Well, I think there are a few other things. Ryan Callahan, the former captain of the Rangers, he just signed a 6-year deal, re-upped with Tampa Bay after he was sent there in the Martin St. Louis trade, and New Yorkers loved Callahan. He was a gritty guy. I wrote at the time this was a win-now trade, obviously. And, the Rangers making the Cup Finals, I think that was a big surprise. So I think, at least in the short term, this was clearly a short-term versus long-term deal. St. Louis this past season and next season, he can help get the Rangers over the hump. But the Rangers are going to need a big-time center. They bought out Brad Richards. But I think a lot of people are still going to look for Brad Richards. It's you snap your fingers and the time goes by, but it was Richards and St. Louis for Tampa Bay 10 years ago who won a cup, and Richards won the Conn Smythe Trophy, but he was kind of missing in action in the Stanley Cup Finals, and I love him. I think he's a great player. The problem is in New York, if you're a Richards or a Nash and you don't score goals, then, you're immediately looked down upon, frankly. I think it's a little unfair in hockey. This isn't basketball when you can, be a stat stuffer. You either score goals or you don't, and those guys didn't score goals. I thought Ryan Miller was a great pickup for St. Louis, but that turned out to be not true. But I think if he can go to San Jose, and I don't know if they're after him or not, but he would certainly be an upgrade for them and give them a chance. There's a couple of other guys, Paul Stastny, I don't know where he's going to wind up. Patrick Roy was named the coach of the year last night, which is very interesting that he would now become a coach, even, the hothead goalie virtually ever. But I don't know if Stastny is going to hit the road. I think he might stay with Colorado, but I think he's another guy. And the thing about Vanek, who at times is a great player, you just don't know. It's the old which Thomas Vanek is going to show up, and I don't know the answer to that. So I think whoever invests a lot of money in him is making a big gamble. But I think Keith said it best before. It's really hard to talk about next season for teams until you see what happens. And this is true in all sports now. There's so much movement in the off-season. Decades ago, of course, this rarely happened. But now there's so much movement in the off-season, you really have to wait till the rosters are set. Although it is true the Rangers have to go out and get a solid scoring center because they simply couldn't score in the finals.
Absolutely, and to tie a couple of different threads there together, the one place that Thomas Vanek, if he is kind of up and down, which he is, one place he should not sign would be New York. They will not have the patience for it. And again, as far as expecting the goal scorers to score goals, it kind of reminds me of when Courtney Brown was the first pick overall in the draft for my Cleveland Browns, and they would talk about subsequently, oh, well, he's great at tying up blockers to let other guys run wild, or, oh, he's pretty good against the run. Wait a minute, we drafted him to get 20 sacks a year. What's going on here? So, yeah, the goal scorer's got to get it done in New York. There will be no margin of error for them if it doesn't happen, no question about that. Gentlemen, a great discussion, as I anticipated. Keith, you are money anytime you are on with us. Always love talking hockey with you. Thank you so much. And, Steve, again, we've talked any number of different subjects with you. I don't even know if we did hockey prior to this, but add this to the endless list that we have tackled. Guys, this was awesome. We'll have to pick this up again sometime here again and talk hockey heading into next year.
Pleasure talking with you both.
Great to be with both of you. We'll do it again sometime. Thanks, Rick.
Thank you both so much, and thank you, everybody, for tuning in today to mini-episode number 434 of the FDH Lounge.
As we bring the show to a close, we would like to extend our deepest gratitude to NBC, CBS, ABC, Fox, all Clear Channel affiliates, TNT, TBS, USA, UPN, Deadspin.com, YouTube.com, YTMND.com, MySpace.com, various blogs, Fox News, CNN, CNBC, MSNBC, IamBoard.com, Billboard.com, Google.com, ESPN, ESPN2, ESPN News, ESPN Classic, NBA TV, NFL Network, Sports Time Ohio, Athlon Magazine, Comedy Central, Cartoon Network, The Boomerang Channel, QVC, BET, The Spice Channel, Steno Notebooks, Manwich, Papermate Office Supplies, waitresses, strippers, bartenders, garbage men, janitors, microwave popcorn, the writers of The Office, Scrubs, Entourage, My Name is Earl, Oz, Metalocalypse and the Boondocks, Aquafina, and the Periodic Table of Elements.